Okay. Man, this is such a well-behaved audience, I swear. This is incredible. All right, well, that's a microphone. Hello, everybody, whether here or online, whether now on June 21st, or January 21st, 2026, or at some point in the bit-delivered future, welcome. I'm Aaron Pratt, the Carl and Lily Pforzheimer Curator of Early Books and Manuscripts here at the Ransom Center, and I'm here to welcome you to the 2025-2026 Annual Pforzheimer Lecture, and to introduce our speaker, the Carl H. Pforzheimer University Professor at Harvard University. That's a lot of Pforzheimer. It turns out that your name can end up on a lot of things if you happen to be one of the founders of the American Stock Exchange and a specialist in oil. Very Texas of him, despite Carl definitely not being from Texas. But I digress. Anne Blair said Pforzheimer Professor specializes in the cultural and intellectual history of early modern Europe, the 16th and 17th centuries. As she puts it on her website, all of her work has pursued a deceptively straightforward question. How did people during this period get intellectual work done? To answer this question, she looks to books, particularly printed books, products of the information technology that has helped shape so much of what has happened in Europe and beyond after Gutenberg and his team published the book over there in the lobby shrine. And I mention it only because that was Carl Pforzheimer's copy, which allows me to get 4 Pforzheimers into this introduction. Now, I'm going to spare everybody, and I've had this very long intro, both a shameful gushing session and a journeyman synopsis of everything that Anne has published. What I will say here is that Anne, as well as anybody I've ever read, is a pro at pursuing what usually falls under the banner of book history, an analysis of culture, ideas, and people through the books that they helped make and or interacted with, maybe even read some of them. Unlike many, and I would say most scholars, Anne is able to pursue book history with a high degree of bibliographical literacy, the ability to look at actual printed books from the early modern period and understand how, as it were, the sausage got made, how the sheets that comprise them actually made their way through the press, and what that might tell us about the goals, desires, successes, and often failures of the investors and artisans who made those books. And so intellectual history through the books, and some of that work is through understanding actually how the books themselves physically got made. I could list tons of Anne's work. I'll mention 2 of her books here, The Theater of Nature, Jean Bedin, and Renaissance Science from 1997. And this, I believe, is from your dissertation. Is that right, Anne? And this, I love, is a book that I've really enjoyed as a kind of, it's kind of a microhistory, I guess, of a kind, looking at probably one of the least studied, before it was published, of Bedin's books, this odd kind of compilation of encyclopedic universal knowledge. And looking not about what makes it distinctive and innovative piece of work on the kind of Renaissance landscape, there's plenty of that to go around, but actually how that book shows Bedin as a humanist very much in his time, and how the pursuit of natural science by a humanist looks much different than what you might see if you've only studied people like Francis Bacon. The book I'm most familiar with, and it's been a major influence on me, is a book from 2010 from Yale called Too Much to Know: Managing Scholarly Information Before the Modern Age. There's so much I could say about this book, too much probably. But what I will say is that this is a book that really tries to think seriously about the intellectual impact of the printing press in a sort of non-teleological way, in a way that doesn't just say, oh, we get modernity, we get greatness, but really how scholars are grappling with the ability, the possibility of accessing way too much stuff to read and way too much to deal with intellectually, right? Like what happens when you have the internet for the first time and you can go to Google Scholar and realize, man, I want to write an article, like how do I read all 8,000 articles about Hamlet that were published last year, which is like the problem of me and some of the grad students that I work with. It's an incredible book, a major success. A couple of things I'll also mention, because this is crazy to me, but in March 2014, Anne delivered the Rosenbach Lectures in Bibliography at the University of Pennsylvania on the role of amanuenses and the hidden helpers who worked with authors and scholars in early modern Europe. And then in December 2019, she delivered the Panizzi Lectures at the British Library on paratexts and print in Renaissance humanism. And then in 2023, she delivered the Lyell Lectures at Oxford on amanuenses in early modern Europe, and has pulled off the triple crown of book history and bibliographical speaking gigs. And like, this is the sort of thing now on like those online betting markets I could have thrown some cash on, because I know that this is exactly the sort of thing that only Anne would be able to pull off. And the amanuenses that Anne spoke about in the Rosenbach Lectures and then again in the Lyell Lectures are the subject of her forthcoming book, Scholars Workshop, Hidden Histories of Collaboration and Authorship, which I believe is due out in July 2026, something like that, so I've done my plug. At the moment, though, Anne will be explaining how Renaissance scholars and printers decided on the size of books. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you very much. That intro topped the intros of the Triple Crown, I can tell you. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be Pforzheimering. And warm thanks to Erin for showing me around today. We really had a great time. So, I'm plugged in. Brilliant. I'm going to, yep. I'm going to mic up. And we're launched. So this is a pretty strange topic. I haven't really given a lecture on it before. It's a topic that, of course, academics fret over. What is the proper size for an academic book? University presses will tell you, well, 100,000 words, big max of 150,000 words, and there is a minimum, too, of about 40,000 words, which gives you a 100-page book, and so then the 240-page book or the 350-page book. And of course, you can play around, as you know, with font size and layout and blank pages and the trim size, whether it's 4x7 or 6x9 inches or something in between. And of course, that's one kind of book. There are many other kinds of books that have each their own conventions. Novels apparently should strive to be 50 to 70,000 words. Ditto for self-help books, they're children's books, heavily illustrated books, and on and on. So we can see how there are tons of conventions around packaging texts. And of course, now we're living in an era when we have machines that can generate verbosity and machines that can read verbosity. And so I think we are going to enter an era where we will value brevity more than ever. The famous line, which apparently Blaise Pascal first used, "I have made this letter longer than usual because I had no time to make it shorter." It's been attributed to many people, in fact. So basically, decisions about how to package texts are made in every time and place and cultural subculture. And I'm going to focus on a corner of Renaissance Europe because that's my area of expertise. But also, I think we can plausibly say that it's a time and place that set conventions that lasted for a long time. And I'd love to talk in the discussion about other conventions and times and places. But to focus on Europe, we're talking about the era when printing is a relatively new technology, and it's kind of finding printers and authors are working together to establish norms. I just here rapidly say that there aren't many technical constraints on what a printer can produce. So we talk a lot about how printing favored the Reformation. Without printing, Luther and the Reformation wouldn't have spread. And of course, that's partly because Luther worked closely with printers and got his message out using short, cheap pamphlets, illustrated also in case you couldn't read. But another factor I'd like to just mention is that one of the reasons Luther was so angry at a process of selling indulgences, which had been going on since the Middle Ages, was suddenly that indulgences could be printed in literally hundreds of thousands and probably even up to 1 million copies very cheaply, selling you a little scrap of paper that everybody in the business knew was worth nothing to print, and yet suddenly could be marked up with the, the great value of marking time off of purgatory. So this is an example of a single-sided sheet that's going to be cut in two and sold, indulgent, and you see the little blank space, as Peter Stallybrass had pointed out in his Rosenbach lectures, to be filled in with your name. And here, by contrast, is what an indulgence looked like in the Middle Ages, where at least you were getting a piece of parchment with nice illumination and so forth, and hopefully more spiritual preparation, which of course Luther was very keen on being omitted from the indulgence campaigns. So that's one, the really short stuff that printing can generate. And printing also generates very big books. This is one of my favorites from Too Much to Know, Theodor Zwinger's Theatrum Humanae Vitae, about 4.5 million words. It's not that there weren't very big books in the Middle Ages. Vincent of Beauvais' Speculum Maius from the 13th century is probably just as big. But in the Middle Ages, no book circulates as a whole thing. We have 300 surviving copies of this book. 2 of them are complete. One of them, of those 2, was the author's copy. So, mostly people commissioned portions of a very big book to be copied out for their use of the stuff they cared about. And one of the 4 mirrors in this collection is the historical mirror. And even that one, which is the most reproduced, was only reproduced in 37 complete copies. So you would select a piece of the part that you liked. So what printing does is suddenly make very big books circulated as big books. No one is, well, we'll talk about whether they are chopping them up, but basically not. So printing is versatile. And basically, the size of a book has to do with conventions, with cultural conventions. We can argue that binding requires a certain size of book to bind, and sometimes modern bindings will add stuff in order to have a certain thickness. But even there, that's a matter of convention, because not all books need to be bound. There were tons of pamphlets that weren't bound. Of course, they don't survive very well because they weren't bound. And then the other solution is to bind books together in a Sammelband, a collected binding. So even that, I don't think, is a constraint, I would say. So I'm going to focus on a particular subculture of Zurich and Basel between 1514 and 65. The reason for this is we have 2 excellent corpora of printer-author teams who work together for a long period. And therefore, although we can't examine the detail of their negotiations, the push and pull, we can pretty much ascertain that the products of these collaborations did not anger one of the partners enough to send them to work with someone else. So basically, they got along reasonably well. So one of them is Erasmus in Basel with Johann Froben and his son Hieronymus Froben. And my other team is Conrad Gessner in Zurich, about a generation later, although they overlapped. I don't know if they'd actually met. Gessner worked with 2 main printers, Froschauer for the famous folios, like the History of Animals, Illustrated, and all that. But actually, the books I'm mainly going to focus on were smaller format and made with his cousins, Andreas and Jakob Gessner, 2 brothers, who worked both together and separately. The relationship is not clear, cousin being a very vague term, but relatives of some kind. And that does play into this. So a big concern of printers, of course, is to have stuff to print, because you need to sell books in order to make money, and you need to get value out of the tremendous investment in your stuff. Your stuff is the printing press, so you can see there, a very clunky, heavy thing, and very heavy masses of metal type. And not only the stuff needs to be is your part of your investment, but also your people, which we see many of here in this later reproduction of sort of early 17th century view. So we can see the pressman pulling the bar, the guy inking the type in the back, and most importantly, we've got the compositor and the proofreader who are in the foreground, who had to know Latin. In this case, I'm talking only learned Latin works, and ideally a little bit of Greek, because sometimes Greek terms pop in there, sometimes Hebrew. That's a rarer skill set. And basically, if a printer runs out of business for these guys, they're going to go elsewhere to a rival printer or out of town. So my main argument, basically, today is that learned printers favored a certain minimum size for a book. And we can watch how cooperative and prolific authors like Erasmus and Gessner met those demands by generating text from which to make a book, and then during the production process by contributing on the spot additional prose as needed to bring the book to a desired size. And I would say that this idea that a big book is a good book, unlike the mega biblion, mega kakon of antiquity, is articulated 100 years later by Adrien Baillet in his 9-volume, but small format, Judgments of the Learned, and he gives a couple of examples. In particular, here he tells of Ericius Puteanus, who was yelled at by the printer Moretus, who's the son-in-law and successor of Plantin in Antwerp, quarreling with him because he complained that Puteanus made only small books that he couldn't sell because they were scorned for being small. And Puteanus retorted, well, Plutarch only wrote small books, which were nonetheless of great value. And Moret threw him out of his shop, deriding him for his vanity and thinking that his books might be worth those of Plutarch. So basically, yeah, it's okay for the ancients to write small books, but if you're a humanist, you better cough up a bigger book. And it does raise the question of, well, is there a limit to what was transmitted in the size of books from antiquity? And this is something that Erasmus and Baillet both talk about to different effects. So what is the longest single work from antiquity that came down to us? Classical antiquity, and that is the 37 volumes plus 1 volume of Index, 38 volumes of Pliny's Natural History. And we can see here, so it was a 2-volume imprint, say, in 1600, and it would be 6.3 buckets of 6 papyrus rolls a piece if you were to roam around with this in antiquity. So for example, by contrast, Livy's History of Rome, which we know was originally, I think, 142 books, actually, of which we have 35 books only. Of course, the Old and New Testament are in that range of 60 to 72 books, and they came in not in buckets, but with the codex form of the early Christians, who really, and that makes it a lot more portable for if you're doing proselytizing, wandering around the Mediterranean. This question that Erasmus poses is, did the existence of an epitome, of a summary of Livy's History of Rome, prevent the long book from being transmitted? And he says yes. Epitomes made in antiquity were responsible for the neglect and loss of the originals, just as some Latin scholars commonly ascribe the loss of Livy's work to Florus, who wrote an epitome of Roman history, or the loss of the civil law of the empire to Justinian, and of theology to the author of the so-called sentences, Peter Lombard, a charge which, in my view at least, is not far from the truth. So he's saying, yes, it's a problem. You made a short version, and that's what comes down to us, rather than the long one. But Baillet, interestingly, in the late 17th century, saying, no, one can't reasonably claim, as some have imagined rather lightly, that an epitome of such little consequence as Florus could have caused an original of such importance as Livy to be forgotten or neglected. Nevertheless, it is perhaps a feature of what has survived from antiquity that is shorter, that transmission of a very long book was a ton of work. And yeah, it was a deterrent from transmitting them. So Quintilian in antiquity is busy calling for brevity. A narration, a statement of facts, prose, in other words, should be lucid, brief, and plausible. And so what we get among my polygraphic authors like Erasmus and Gessner is apologies, a defensiveness about how prolix they are. So I love this one in particular because of my work on amanuenses, which actually got me started on this whole topic, in fact. In his preface, he explains, of course, this is a very, it's 1,500 folio pages, it's very long. I won't deny that the summaries or chapters of some books that he provides copied out in his book are explicated more verbosely than I would like. But this occurred mainly in the first letter of the alphabet, when I relied on the work of amanuenses. In the rest, I would not want to be briefer. So he's basically apologizing for being long-winded and saying it's the fault of the amanuenses he hired. In any ways, it's good for you to have a lot. So we can see here, though, when you are going to defend being prolix, you then have an example of excess prolixity. And there's this poor guy, Thomas Hasselbach, who was long dead by the time this was being reported about him, a theologian not without renown, who writes histories that are not without usefulness, and I would praise him were it not that he spent 22 years commenting on the first chapter of Isaiah and has not reached the end. So this is bad, okay? There is such a thing as too much. And so this is, I first found this reported by Pope Pius II in a letter printed in 1505, which dated earlier. And we have this repeated then, including by this guy Jeremias Drexel, who's one of many people who offer advice on how to write long books by taking copious notes and storing them in your notebooks that then you can recycle. Except that here, of course, Hasselbach is a bad thing. Do not follow his advice. Learned vanity and laborious idleness. Why waste one's time on paltry things when we lack time for necessary ones? So he too wants to draw the line here on not, there is such a thing as too much. So the humanist author and printer are driving between having enough to keep the presses busy and not going overboard. So my first case study is going to be with Erasmus and his Froben guy. So Erasmus published roughly an estimate of 220 first editions. We're going to call this princeps editions. And many, many of these were reprinted multiple times in his lifetime, sometimes with modifications, sometimes with his permission, other times not, etc. He was a best-selling author. And of these princeps editions, 138 were published with one of the Froben's. And in fact, Erasmus accounts for about 50% of the Froben's business. So there's no way the Froben's don't do Erasmus's bidding, which includes never print anything by Luther, for example. Because that's the cost, you know, if you're going to do my stuff. So of those 138, 22 of these books are composite. And a composite book is a book that contains multiple texts, either by the same author or by different authors. And of course, this is one way to get a book of a significant heft. If your writings are too short, you glue them together. So here are, especially in the first years of Erasmus' collaboration with Froben, you see all of the green ones are famous Erasmus works. And you can see that they are all printed first with other stuff, either by Erasmus or by other people. And of course, and here we have later in life, Erasmus continues to print composites with Froben, but they are more often with other Erasmus texts. So many of Erasmus' famous works are folios, and of course, we're not talking about those, the adages, the New Testament, the editions of Jerome and Augustine and Ambrose and so forth. But a lot of the things that get assigned in syllabi today are short books, very convenient, here with, you know, a 100-page thing with a little intro and some notes, and you've got yourself an Erasmus text. But none of these appeared alone with Froben. They were always with other things, and the modern edition has just completely ignored the other stuff with which they were packaged. And the beauty of the digitizations we've got, thanks to ERARA and the MDZ in Munich, are that we can see how the texts were actually published, fleshed out with tons of paratexts and multiple texts that have not been canonized, so who cares? So here's an example, the Complaint of Peace. And so a classic Froben title page with this nice border. It tells you Complaint of Peace and other stuff listed on the next page. And you can see why they don't put it on the title page, because the other stuff in there is very voluminous. We have a declamation on death, then we have recent Lucian translations, then we have other Lucian translations, and then we have More's Utopia, More's epigrams, Erasmus's epigrams. Okay, so we have a lot of stuff in this book. And then we get to the end after 642 pages, and we get a Froben to the reader saying, so sorry, the book's too long. We won't be including Utopia and epigrams by More and Erasmus as promised. It's like, hello, did you not realize this was going to be a long book ahead of time? Anyway, so mysteries here. These books are wonderful to play with. And by the way, a Froben to the reader in Latin, they're all in Latin, was not by Froben. Froben did not know Latin. And so we know that it's someone in Erasmus' entourage, either Erasmus or other guys at the press who created these little paratexts. And I'm relying here also on the wonderful work of Alexandre van Outgaerden. Erasmus Typograph is a beautiful book, and he really goes into detail on who might have written these and why it wasn't Froben. So here we have the texts that were promised but omitted, and here they are, the three of them lined up, Utopia, epigrams by More, and epigrams by Erasmus, again with a lovely title page and border. Another example, so Complaint of Peace has been divorced from the stuff it was first published with, and it can't go off alone, so it goes off with other stuff. Still with the Declamation of Death, which it had been paired with originally, but none of the Lucian. Instead, two encomia by Erasmus on matrimony and on medical art. So in a way, here it's possibly the genre of the sort of oratorical piece, a declamation, that's drawing these together, that it isn't the theme of peace particularly, but maybe some other rhetorical commonality they haven't, justifies the glomming together. I mean, but it's really, he doesn't explain it, of course. So I'm going to talk a bit about the most famous example of a composite book that we've forgotten about is The Praise of Folly, which was printed singly, we can see here on the left, in 96 pages by other printers prior to Erasmus coming to Basel and starting to work with Froben. So these were legitimate authorized editions, but just the text. So now, in 1515, he is making a new edition with a lot of new material. It comes, you can see here on the title page, lists the contents, 3 works, let's see, yeah. There's a fourth later, the letter to Dorp in the next edition, but we'll forget that one. So first we have Seneca, which is on the death of the Emperor Claudius, which is basically mocking his apotheosis. So it's a Menippean satire, which technically is a medley of poems and prose, with a comment by Beatus Rhenanus, one of Erasmus's sidekicks, who's working with Froben as well. Then we have Synesius of Cyrene, a praise of baldness, which within it has something by Dio on baldness, which we now think was forged by Synesius. And all this is commented on by an Englishman named John Free. And then we have the praise of folly, with comment by Gerard Listrius. But then Erasmus in a letter complains that Listrius wasn't coughing up this commentary, and Erasmus wrote most of it. So here we have the effect that Erasmus wants, that we have a Seneca, although it's a mocking Seneca, but with commentary. Then we have Synesius, who's a pretty obscure late antique guy, with commentary. And then we have Erasmus with commentary. And this is probably the first time we have a humanist text, modern text, presented in this classic humanist way of treating an ancient text in the center of a commentary. So this is a way of Erasmus sort of boosting his praise of folly. He is as worthy of this treatment. And of course, he's also showing that there are ancient antecedents to the genre of, the mocking satire that the praise of folly is. So one could make a strong argument, which has been made, that this is why he has made a composite book. But it's also the case that the praise of folly is a short book. And it had recently been published singly by other printers. So it's important for Froben to do something new with it. Fleshing it out is definitely one of those things. So how do you flesh it out? And here's an internal colophon inside. So the first work ends with, after the Seneca, we have a colophon complete with the printer's mark and the whole bit. And then we have an internal title page going on to the praise of folly. So it does pose the question was this book designed, even though it's paginated continuously, to be possibly marketed separately? In this particular, in the praise of folly, the internal title pages don't recur, but I have other examples of internal colophonic pages and title pages inside composites quite frequently. So it's something worth thinking about. So just how short did Erasmus Froben imprints go? And here is the shortest one, 38 pages. It is "War is sweet to those who do not know it." It is one adage from inside the giant adages that has been excerpted and published in 1517. And there are 2 other excerpted adages which were published together, paginated and acquired continuously, but each with a separate title page, possibly to be marketed separately. And together they come to 82 pages. But here we have some fascinating backstory about how this happened. In the form of a letter from Beatus Rhenanus, that nice, sidekick to Erasmus, writing to Erasmus who's out of town and dealing with the home front in Basel and Froben. Whatever you send them, new compositions, revisions, translations, your own or other people's, they will gladly accept and will show themselves truly grateful. There was very nearly war between Froben and me while I was trying to get your Bellum, that 38-page thing, printed by itself. Froben appeared at my house quite out of breath, begging and beseeching me to let him have some little thing of yours to print, that he might not be obliged to take a holiday after your decopia, while Lachner, his father-in-law who's got the money, is on his way back from Frankfurt for the book fair. This is his regular practice, never to come and ask for copy until he already has no work left to keep his men busy. So I produced your Sileni, one of these 2, which he accepted. Next morning, I went down to the works. Goodness me, what uncalled for complaints I found waiting for me about himself and me. Did I think he was a publisher of the class who print ballads in the vernacular? He had no interest in small stuff like this, and it was pretty unfriendly of me to provide him with a few pages and not great tomes. Froben made me more than a little heated with all this fuss, But since your interests, or rather the interests of educated people, were at stake, I kept a tight hold on myself, and by prayers, threats, and blandishments, at last secured that the Bellum and the Scarabaeus, this one, should be printed at the same time. They are afraid that this publication may harm your proverbs, as in the big edition of the adages that they were also working on. So we can see here this indignation, that small stuff, this vernacular ballads. I am a proper learned printer, and give me big tomes. And we can imagine that the blandishments involved that for both these two, Beatus Rhenanus supplied commentary to create more bulk. And he probably did it, with not much notice. We can see Erasmus talking about the right size of a book when he's talking about the Colloquium Familiarum Formulae, which becomes the Colloquies. But it was first published without his permission, and so he didn't acknowledge it, although Erasmus was also known for kind of floating things that he didn't acknowledge. And then he explains in this letter to Botzheim how he made it large. At length, by taking more than ordinary pains, I added a good deal to bring it up to the right size for a book and make it seem at least seem to deserve the honor of a dedication to Johann Froben's son, Johannes Erasmius, who was then a boy of 6 and astonishingly gifted. So here we have Erasmus himself talking about what's a right size, what's a respectable size. So the first one, which is clearly not respectable, is 95 pages, and it only hit 95 pages because 2 letters of Erasmus had been stuffed in to get it up to that from the 72 that the work was by itself. And then what he calls respectable is 207 pages. These are all octavos, so these are not long things. So that's one thing, get a minimum bulk. The other factor, though, is to make something distinct from a recently published item published by a different printer. And so here we have the Praise of Folly from 1514, and then the new Praise of Folly with all that good stuff that went from 96 pages to 238 pages the next year. And here we see the composites that I showed you with all the new stuff now in green. Now we're seeing in red what of the composites had been published by a different printer recently. Every composite has something that had been recently published, except for the epigrams, actually, but most of them have something that had recently been printed by someone else. So what's going on here is a desire to not anger your confreres, the printers, with whom you're constantly trading deals and unsold books and so forth at Frankfurt Book Fairs. Regardless of privilege or no privilege, you don't want to undercut their business by printing the exact same thing right before they've had time to sell their stock. So unless they turn around and do the same to you. So this is a very cool one. This is the first of the composites, actually. And what we see here are 4 pamphlets taking the form of letters or an elegy about recent battles, followed by 4 letters of Erasmus. So the 4 letters of Erasmus, of course, have been canonized. They are the first letters of Erasmus that Erasmus published. This is a Froben imprint. I have found digital copies of 2 of the 4, a third of those 4 pamphlets. A third is attested at the British Library. I haven't seen it yet. A 4th one doesn't seem to survive, but I'm convinced that it was once a standalone pamphlet. But the only version of it we have is through this composite text. But of course, we have and historians have basically completely forgotten about these pamphlets. But they were the classic thing, which are actually letting Froben capitalize on political interest, and yet it doesn't reproduce exactly any of the pamphlets, which had just been printed the previous year in basically Rome, all of them, I think, because he's putting them all together, and then he's adding Erasmus letters, in which Erasmus is boasting about the forthcoming New Testament publication. So he's puffing his own stuff, and Froben, of course, is puffing a Froben imprint. So that's an example of all the things you can accomplish with some of the things you can accomplish with a composite book. I'm now going to turn to Conrad Gessner, who has the distinct advantage of being quite chatty in his proverbs. And I have in my text the sausage is made, which Aaron was mentioning. It's exactly what Gessner is and we can think why. Why does he tell us how the sausage is made? And you can start ruminating on that topic. So we're talking about Gessner and his cousins, the brothers Andreas and Jakob Gessner, in Zurich, a little bit later on. So we have an example here. This is not about bulk in the same way. We have a 580-page book comprising the description of Africa by Leo Africanus, 560 pages, and then the navigation of Hanno, chief of the Carthaginians, which was written in Greek, translated by Conrad Gessner for the first time ever, adding 20 pages. Clearly, the book was plenty big already. Andreas Gessner imprint. So, why do you do that? The Hanno does have a separate title page, potentially for marketing, already including the complete title page, also with the date and et cetera. And it is paginated continuously, I think. So Gessner writes in the dedication to this work, when during these last days, my cousin Andreas was putting through the press the Africa of Leo Africanus, he asked if I could add something new to it. And since I didn't have the leisure for larger things, I quickly translated and added comments, composed too quickly, on the Navigatio of Hanno, in which is described the greater part of the shore of Libya. It was the labor of a short day. So why does he ask this? Just 3 years before, in Antwerp, a nice edition of Africanus's description of Africa had been printed. In fact, cum privilegio, which is a monopoly to print this work, doesn't say on the title page how long it would have been for, but probably 5 to 7 years. Of course, Gessner is operating in Zurich, and Antwerp is a different jurisdiction, so it doesn't matter that there's a privilege. What really is holding Andreas Gessner from just wantonly reprinting this is this relationship collegial relationship with other printers. So please, Cousin Conrad, can you cough something up to make this new edition new enough, different enough? And there we are. Same maneuver for a giant work. This is a collection of works on De Anima, published this time by Jakob Gessner, the other cousin. And it's already 1,315 pages long, so it's a real chunk. And then we're going to have a Gessner De Anima of 230 pages. So it's a challenge to bind this thing. It's really pushing the edges of what's feasible. But here we have a Basel printer who just 3 years before had printed the first 3 De Animas. And now we get the new edition with Conrad's addition. And here again, we have in the preface, my cousin the printer was printing a set of works on De Anima and asked me if I could add something new of my composition. So why does he say all this? Here we have Gessner producing a complete book on demand. My cousin Jacob asked me if I have anything to occupy an idle press. I drew from the pile of my papers this little book, which is a Greek edition and translation into Latin of the Medical Questiones by Cassius, a quite obscure ancient Greek medical author, to which was added a catalog of medicaments by Schneeberger, who was a former student of Gessner. But interestingly, I haven't seen the copy on Irara doesn't have the catalog of medicaments at the moment. A previous copy on Irara did. So I'm definitely going to check this out when I'm in Zurich in a couple of months. So basically we see here Jacob is asking Conrad for stuff. And why is he saying, look, I, Conrad, am a good guy to work with. And actually, in 1562, the same year, he published an autobibliography of all the books he had published and a list of 18 works he had in manuscript. Hint, hint. Anybody interested in publishing these? You know? And of course, those 18 works, though, didn't get published, except a few after Conrad's death, so no one took him up on that. So let's look inside the Cassius now. So we have our text, and then we get what I call the lest blank trope. We added what follows in order to fill some pages. And these are excerpts from various authors about the term problema, which Cassius had used. So we can talk about this horror vacui, which is attributed to scribes in the Middle Ages, that you have a text block, you want it to look neat, and if you don't have enough text, you repeat a line, you put in a prayer, you do something so that it fills out. So, with print, why this problem? So we can see here that it ends on signature K, page 2. A signature of an octavo is going to have 8 leaves, and we're only on 2, so there's 6 to go. So it's a lot of waste, and you can't just rip out those pages and use them for something else, because then you would endanger the conjugate. They would just fall out. So you have to have those spots, but you don't want to leave them blank, apparently. I don't know, the buyer might feel they were getting ripped off. You know, they bought a book of this many pages, but 8 of them are blank. Ah. So Gessner provides extracts from reference books he has on hand, Suda's dictionary and the word problem, Alexander of Aphrodisias and the word problem, and he gets to the end, signature K4V. We're good. Perfect. Ending. End of the choir. And it was a short choir, half choir, clearly. He didn't want to overdo it. Now here is another work where Gessner is printing the manuscript of a deceased contemporary physician, recently deceased, Jodokus Willik. He talks about in the preface how he found this manuscript lying around at Operinus, the printer in Basel, and he asked if he could have it, and he took it over, and look who's printing it, Jacob, just always keeping, you know, his cousin in mind. So here we have a Finnis marker. It's a book on cooking, where we're at 6 out of 8. Pretty good, don't have to add much. So we have a lest this something from the page, some of the choir remain blank. I decided to add a letter by Jacobus Bifrons on cheese making. Very cool, right? This is Switzerland. And this letter by Bifrons is listed here underneath. Jacob Bifrons, under my circle, actually, is listed on the title page. So it's sort of, the title page was made after this edition. Great, so we have the cheese making. Drive through the cheese making. Oops, the cheese making letter was too long. He's gone into another choir, P, and he's only on page 2 of P. So what do? He has, again, a little blurb. Lest some paper remain blank at the end of this little book, we added some things not unrelated to the topic. And in particular, he adds his entry on Willik, the author of the main thing, in his own Bibliotheca Universalis. So he's rehashing his Bibliotheca Universalis contents, which actually carries into a new choir again, but he doesn't call attention to that. Instead, he ends perfectly with a few pages of index. And so we end on the last page of the last choir, 17 choirs, 16 pages, 272 pages. The perfect ending. So why does he make this explicit? On the one hand, it's a humility trope. I was rushed, you know, as apology for haste. But also, right, you can count on Gessner when copia is needed, because presumably this is happening at the press. You know, oops, you know, here we are. And Gessner runs home and pulls out something. I don't know, or maybe it was planned. Of course, the index is indicated on the title page, but those other excerpts from the Bibliotheca are not. But the cheese-making letter is. So what was planned, what was not planned? Complicated. Just to cycle back to Erasmus a little bit, Erasmus's first imprint was precisely produced under these circumstances on the analysis of the expert Percy Stafford Allen in his study of Erasmus's correspondence. So in 1495, Erasmus was a young man hanging out in Paris, had just written some flowery Latin letters to Robert Gauguin, among other people, hoping to make it into the humanist circles in Paris. And so this is on the origin and deeds of the Franks, 1495. It ends with 3.5 pages to go. And so then what happens? We have a Carmen by a guy, by Fausto Andrelini, followed by a blurb by this guy Montanat, and then 2 pages, very single-spaced, by Erasmus. And Allen says the 2-page letter was drawn out to a greater length than was necessary. And clearly, you know, Gauguin, having received a letter from Erasmus recently, thought he was a good guy to tap to fill out his book, this Incunabulum. Again, the horror vacui. So with a few more examples just of how you end a choir, you can do it. There are certain things you want to put at the end of a book in this early phase. So one is the colophon. It indicates where and when it was printed. So Venice, Aldus, this is the first edition of the famous adages of 1508. Then a register is a list of the signature letters, usually, or symbols, to make sure as a buyer or a binder that you've got everything in there before you bind it. And then a printer's mark. But you can see here that in this case, the acquiring is ending on, this is the last page of the last choir of this book. And if you need to do it efficiently, you can do it efficiently. You can take, you know, basically 1/4 of a page and stuff all that in there. But in 1518, Froben's adages, of course the adages have been lengthened and so forth, is ending on the 6th page of your classic 8-page, 8-leaf quiring. And so you've got some blanks. And so he provides that information in a long, drawn-out way. First of all, we have a Froben to the reader telling you how great this is. Then we have a register which not just provides the letters the way the 1508 one did, but the first words of each of the first pages of each quire. So you can fill out a whole page with that. Then we have a colophon telling you that it was printed in Basel by Froben. And, you know, fare you well, you who read this, who will read this. And then we have a printer's mark. So when you want to, you can drag it out so that it ends on the last page of the last quire very neatly. I have more slides, but I think my time should be up so we can have a conversation about how basically these printers, you know, relied on certain kinds of authors to be there to supply copy when needed at the macro level, even initiating a publication, at the medium level to supplement or lengthen a text, or to supply sufficient novelty to warrant a reprinted text, and at the micro level, filling up pages that were blank at the end of a quire by working on the spot of the printers. So, yes, I hope you've enjoyed this little excursus into the humanist equivalent of haggling over word counts today. Okay, I'm going to take my pen with me, too. Yes.
All right. I'm going to take hosts'
Yes, of course.
opportunity here. You know, one of the things I was thinking about when you're looking at the really long chunkers is that the Germans and the Swiss, sort of by proximity, can tolerate a cube of a book. You know, one of the things that you notice when you have stack access to an institution like the Ransom Center is you can just walk through the stacks and you see these little squat, like, and these are, so like these different formats, right? You've got the folios, you've got octavos, or quartos and octavos can come in many different sizes. And a lot of these German ones are real squat.
Yes.
And then they're long as hell.
Yeah,
and
like a cube, as you
they're
say.
like really, like genuinely cubic. And I'm wondering, you know, this kind of question about the right size of books is, I wonder, I guess just your examples vary so much in terms of like the actual sort of heft of the book, but there seems to be something about like the quantity of titles. And so maybe just asking us to think together maybe a little bit about like what exactly is the quantity they're trying to reach. Is it something about quantity of content or actually literal sheet count?
Yeah, that's a great question. And obviously it's variable. But I think some of it's sheet count.
Yeah.
I mean, this whole idea of adding and adding and adding,
Yeah.
so you get to, does seem to be that. And why those books, I mean, the composites, for example.
Yeah.
So part of it is because of, you know, having to be new enough.
Right.
So obviously it wasn't sheet count for the very squat books that just get squatter.
Right.
Yeah, and obviously getting Erasmus's name, or Gessner's name for that matter,
Right.
on it is part of it, although that really works for Erasmus. Gessner, I don't think, was such a big name.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's saleability and branding. I don't know what Froben really got out of the content of what he was printing, given that, so the main evidence we have that he didn't know Latin is Erasmus has a PS, get someone to read this letter to you who knows Latin. Okay?
Solid.
Solid, yeah.
Solid.
So he has compositors and, you know, people around him who are advising and are producing these paratexts and so forth. So I have another great example of Caramuel, you know, his syntagma on printing.
Yeah.
You know, there's a little prefatory blurb to that, which explains that a bunch of quires went missing in the transmission of the text to be printed, to Lyon to be printed. And so I'm giving you this instead.
Right.
And the front matter is full of poems and punning. And I mean, it's got, you know, basically when you boil down to it, half of the book is the content. And the other half is this other stuff, which we can call paratexts. And of course, a giant index and so forth. They're just kind of, you know, dragging it out.
Yeah.
So, and of course, it was part of a set. You know, it was supposed to match, I think. so it's got to be of a reasonable heft. But once the stuff is lost, obviously the idea of rewriting that content, I don't know, maybe you didn't keep a copy.
Yeah,
Who knows?
Yeah, yeah.
So you supply other stuff.
Yeah.
So
Both.
yeah, I think that's right. And they are so verbose. They really are. Oh my gosh, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Erasmus goes on. And that's, of course, that's part of the, humanist rhetoric.
Right.
Is you're supposed to show off. You're supposed to show off how many different ways you can repeat something and how many different ways you can apologize or thank and so some of that is aesthetic and obviously just an aesthetic that they valued. But yeah, in terms of just content, it's not the most efficient way of getting, of conveying content.
Yeah, thank you. I can take some questions from the crew out here. Okay. Ellen, do I see you?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. This is fascinating and also just terrifically fun. I think there's a couple of book conservators here in the audience who occasionally have to deal with some of these cubic books. And I'm wondering, in your work, if you've run across, there must have been multiple binders all over the place, binding these texts. If you've run across any correspondence between the printers and the binders. Yeah.
Sadly, not in the stuff I've worked on. So the Erasmus stuff, all we have basically are Erasmus's letters. And actually we have many fewer letters from him to other people. Let's see, that's because he prints those letters. That's our main source. And then, so printers' records, so Plantin, I think that is your best bet. The Plantin archive will have stuff on that.
Yes.
I haven't particularly worked in that.
That's about it.
Yeah, there aren't many. I mean, they didn't have name, brand. I mean, what kind of letters do you save? Although there are a few maybe, and they're in Swiss German, and I haven't read them, that are in Basel. I mean, actually Switzerland does have some nice, having had fewer destructive acts on their libraries and so forth has been a plus.
I just can imagine some of these binders losing their minds.
Yes, but of course,
mainly
the interactions would have been oral too, though. We were talking about how they have guys who they deal with, and they come over and pick up stuff and bring it back, and so and in fact, many of these author-printer relationships, these powerful relationships, are in person. They're living close by. Froben supplied a house to Erasmus in Basel. So that's why we're stuck kind of with the product and trying to infer relationships from the product.
Yeah, I mean, we have binders getting real pissed off at, we were talking about this earlier, like the Stationers Company of London, where the binders are like, these booksellers are screwing us left and right, because they're not giving us work over immigrants. There's weird stuff that happens there, but so much of it is about the booksellers not having the interest of the binders in mind. And then when you look at the books, you can see the books get corner cutting to get the damn thing bound as quickly as possible with all kinds of various techniques that we could talk about. But you can really see the binder, the screws are coming to them. And if you take apart, or one of these cubes is falling apart, it's like skip station sewing and bypass sewing all the way through. And so you can see that they're not, they're not taking the sweet time to bind, 8,000 sheets of Gessner.
And these would be 17th century or even 16th century.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The corner cutting comes fast.
Early.
Comes fast.
Right. Nice.
Rachel.
Hi. Thank you so much for this. I really found myself charmed by the portrait of Gessner running around finding drafts of things to fill these quires, because as someone who's worked in journalism in another life, that seems very modern for a writer to be asked to do that. And I found it kind of challenging my understanding of the writer as a profession, as much as thinking of the relationship between a printer and a writer. So I wondered how you kind of feel about these great humanist authors when you're noticing this work happening with these books.
Well, I think that is part of the sausage making. So I love this article by George Hoffman in PMLA. It's on Montaigne's monopoly. So Montaigne, he published his first edition of the Essays in 1580, two books. Then there comes the third book, and then so basically there's 1582, there's 1588, and then there's 1595 after his death, which is even longer. And the 1588 says it's been augmented by a third. Why do you specify that? You need a new privilege. These things are happening precisely at the expiration of the prior privilege, which is basically 7 or 8 years in these cases. So, of course, Montaigne had invested in the publication with the printer. So they're both in it, wanting to make money on what turned out to be quite a successful book called Essay, which is clearly a new genre. But the motive, therefore, to tell more about his complex, deep thoughts, it has a commercial element to it. And Hoffman goes into detail a passage which is added in the margin in 1588, the Bordeaux copy, which ends up in 1595, but it's a passage that's much reworked. So in the margins, he's crossing out, it's like, when the printers ask something of me, is basically how it starts. And then he sort of, how does he phrase this? What does he do exactly? So I don't think it reduces their greatness. I mean, I think, and plus, for Gessner, he's a compiler, to be blunt about it.
Yeah, yeah.
And he actually will be very honest he says sometimes he authors things, but he uses the word compilator, compilavit, and he describes his work quite a bit: edited, commented, compiled, gathered, congessit, and of course, that's a very important thing that he did. It's we who have decided that, well, it's not original enough, et cetera, et cetera. So I feel it's part of the work. Now, Gessner was also constantly complaining about being too poor, that he wasn't getting paid enough as a physician of the city of Zurich.
Right.
And in fact, in his letter to Bullinger, his boss, saying, please, give me a raise, he says, printers only do big books, and I'm exhausted writing these big books, and basically I need to be better paid. And so he's complaining about that, but he clearly is being paid by the inch a little bit. I mean, we know Bullinger was paid pretty handsomely, because Bullinger is a really big deal by the folio page. So I don't know. I mean, I think by lengthening a book, he might have gotten some more money for it, or he could have haggled for more. I don't know about the commerce of also dealing with the cousin. Obviously, he wants to give business to the cousin, but I'm sure he asked for money too.
Maddie?
Thanks so much for this. It's really fascinating. I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about paper. How does this story look if we want to talk about, paper, and are your guys discussing that? I mean, obviously they're thinking about sort of the quires and everything, but if paper is the biggest expense, right, for these printers, to some degree, this is helping me understand why there are so many chunky books from early modern Europe, right? There's this sort of paradox that we have paper's really expensive, but also here's, a 4-volume work on.
Yeah, paper doesn't scale. You don't benefit, obviously making 1,000 copies or 500 copies is very necessary to do. You don't print to make 2 copies, but paper, just the expense goes up with each copy. You don't get any sort of benefit from doing multiples. I'm wondering also this is making me think about trading. At Frankfurt Book Fair, you could swap sheets.
Yes.
So the fatter your book, the more sheets you get from the other guys.
Yeah.
And that might be part of it.
Well, and because the cost is proportionate to the length broadly,
Yes.
It's not quite like inch, but one of the things is that if you make a fatter book, and if your goal basically as a printer is like, how many sheets can I churn out? As a publisher, the same thing, like sheets are the unit of sale, right? It's books, make up sheets. But if you've got you have to sell fewer copies of longer books. You have to speculate on behalf of fewer potential customers if you can land it. It's like selling books to academic libraries or something, right?
Yes.
Where like reference books will sell, if anybody, to these, and you can put out a chonker. And that's not how we don't charge by sheet now. But I think there's something there where essentially you're like, look, I've got 50 guys or 200 guys or 300 guys who will buy this.
Yes.
So let's make it longer so I don't have to make a shorter book's going to have 600 guys to buy it to make it work. And I wonder sometimes, I mean, that's certainly what it seems like with these massive tomes, is that you're like, well, I can do the works of John Chrysostom and sell like 5 of those because they're big. And I think there might be something there.
That's a great point. And I also think the profit margins are going to be higher with
100%.
the high-end buyers.
100%.
Yeah. So definitely.
Bigger book.
Bigger books
Yeah.
are good things.
But if it doesn't sell, you're more screwed.
Yes.
You know, so
This is also true.
yeah.
But the whole thing is risky business. So
Totally.
might as well.
Yeah. So right here, and then we'll get
Yes, to what degree did the printers rely on woodcuts to augment the missing pages in quires?
That's a great question. So my books, I haven't gone into, Gessner does have illustrated books, and you're right that you can have a full page illustration, for example, or a smaller page illustration. And unlike today, when you can just scale it on your PDF or whatever, they had to recarve the whole thing, you know. So one thing about illustrated books that has been nicely shown is that they would start with the folio, with the big pictures, and then they would make shorter books of two kinds. One was picture books with the same prints, you know, the same images, but less words. So it was a shorter book, could sell for less. And the other was to make smaller format with the same pictures, but smaller. So they had to recarve them. But the labor of making them from nature and hiring the person to make an original, you know, print was saved because the next guy can just copy. So they did do that, and that's tranching down. So you would catch your people who are willing to pay top dollar for the full size. Then you could do a quarto, and then you could do an octavo for the really cheapo ones. But it's true that in these books, they don't use woodcuts. They have ornaments sometimes. And of course, the printer's mark is a woodcut and is designed to, because it did take up some space and stuff. But a woodcut was also expensive, honestly, unless you have it on hand. Like Froben always had stuff, you know, the borders, he had a ton of them, and people have studied, you know, how often he reused them and stuff like that.
yeah, bordering, like borders, like, you know, tail pieces, head pieces. Those are your quire fillers if you need them. Mock turtleneck, red. Yeah.
I'm curious about quality and both how contemporary readership thought about these add-ons. Were they considered to be lesser, or were they acknowledged to be written hastily and of a kind of B tier?
That's a fascinating question, and unfortunately, you know, it's really hard to answer what the buyers thought of all this. Right. Because, yeah, it's a great question. You know, finding correspondence about it would be really hard. Someone complaining that someone had larded something, that would be worth thinking about. Right. I'm aware of, this is different though, but of like auctions where they say we're selling the books of this famous, that were owned by this famous person, and there are complaints that they're stuffing in books that wouldn't sell, that have nothing to do with the famous person, you know, to try and just move this stuff. So there is awareness that people are cheating and stuff like that. But I do have an example from the Gessner of a composite book where it's sold with one title page, and then there is a second issue with the whole first quire is reprinted in order to get a different new title page, which highlights, so the first title page highlights the Ovid, which was a short piece in there, and then there were other things. And the next title page highlights Gessner. So, but it had the same content. So we can infer that the first version didn't sell, right? Didn't sell enough. So you want to try again with a different pitch to the buyers.
Yeah.
But a lot of these things don't sell. I mean, I love this line from Hugh Amory, you know, most printed books have never been read.
Right.
Because printing is about overabundance. You have to make more copies than you're actually, you know, because you'll never make a profit if you don't make enough copies to have a profit.
Right.
Then the fact that you maybe just break even because half of the stuff didn't sell, or you go broke because, you know.
Really didn't sell.
Exactly. So that's a great question. I think, too, what's really fun to think about is those political pamphlets plus the Erasmus letters. We're obsessed with the Erasmus letters. But I can easily think that what people really cared about was the political pamphlets at the time. So, and similarly, when, you know, I don't know, the Lucian dialogues and the complaint of peace, what are people wanting out of that? Sometimes the Erasmus is, we have no doubt that it's the Erasmus, but that's ex post facto.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think we have hit time, and there's a reception which you should go to. So let's thank Anne again for a great talk. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Very good. All right. Success.